In this episode, I speak to Caroline Bowen from Dabalox, an AI-driven startup which is making it easier for consumers to choose and install heat pumps into their homes. We touched on several of the issues facing roll-up heat pumps, and Caroline pointed out that they currently only heat 2% of the UK's homes, compared to the 2050 target, which is 80%. So a very long way to go, and a very interesting question of how this can be achieved and what the problems are. I started off though by asking Caroline to just explain why heat pumps are crucial for achieving net zero.
Well, I think if we take a step backwards, most people have heard about net zero and the ambition to essentially decarbonize the UK. And we've set targets by 2050 we will be at net zero, which means we're not creating net carbon. So there'll be some things which create carbon, but then there's going to be other things which absorb carbon. For instance, trees, actually, trees absorb carbon. So there'll be different ways that we can start to manage and balance things out to get to net zero. So when we start to think about like actually where does carbon get created? I mean, I always think about this, is you almost need to think about your kind of like your personal carbon as like a dinner plate. And you can start to say, well, a quarter of it comes from my travel. A quarter of it actually comes from my food. A quarter of it comes from all of our life and everything the government's doing for us, and road maintenance through to walls and government buildings. And then a quarter of it actually comes from our homes. So
Mm.
it's remarkably, when you think about it like that, it's quite sort of simple. It makes you realize that actually your travel is really important, and also your home is really important. So the seventh carbon budget lays out the roadmap for what the UK could and should do to hit net zero by 2050. And the biggest chunk of that, 23% of the decarbonisation, will come from the switch from petrol and diesel cars through to electric cars. We kind of know about that. We're seeing a lot of EV cars. But what will surprise a lot of people is the second most important piece on there is actually our homes. So 14% of the whole decarbonisation we're going to deliver in the UK will need to come from the decarbonisation of our homes. And what does that really mean? That means we need to switch away from using gas to electric based solutions, of which the heat pump is the most effective at the moment. And to put this into sort of context, the next on the list is actually at 11% is decarbonisation of the grid. So
Mm.
turning our homes from gas to electricity is actually even more important than the electrification and all these wind farms and all these solar. And if we're not electrifying our homes, what are we actually also going to do with all the electricity, renewable electricity we're creating?
Yeah, so Climate Change Committee, half of UK homes need to have heat pumps by 2040, which
Yep,
is
they do.
huge.
Yep.
I mean, that's a
And it will be about
vast change.
80% of homes by 2050.
Mm,
And today, I think 2%.
really. Wow, that's incredible. And I mean, I'm really interested to get into why why we at 2%. And I know that a lot of this is due to these sort of myths um, about heat pumps. Could you maybe give us some of your favorites that come to mind? What are the misconceptions people have?
Well, it's a difficult one, and this is actually, customers have got so many, or homeowners have got so many questions, and this is
Mm,
actually also the heart of what Dabalox is trying to support with, which is actually answering people's questions. Um, but that leads us to why so many questions, and I think your point around myths. I mean, there's a lot of press out there which is quite negative about heat pumps. And we can postulate about what's driving that. I think there's ample people who will talk about actually a lot of that is funded by the oil and gas industries briefing against heat pumps. I have no first-hand knowledge of that, but it's a hypothesis because actually heat pumps are amazing. They manage to take heat from the air around a building. So and this is why people have questions because they're complicated. They don't understand how can it work? How can a heat pump work when it's freezing outside because it's
mm,
frozen? And you start to go, well, actually, there's quite a lot of physics in there, and that foxes people. And because we don't have them around our houses and we don't know people with them, we get confused about it. I mean, let me step back and say, if I asked you about your gas boiler, what can you tell me about your gas boiler?
Yeah, not an awful lot.
Yeah, exactly. People will tell you it's large, it's small. Then you ask them if it's condensing or not, and they go, "Oh, I'm not sure." Only if they've changed it in the last few years will they know. And then they might say, "Oh, I've got a hot water tank." But that is the extent of a conversation about a gas boiler. And it's a boring conversation. And I heard this great joke. Somebody said, how do you know if somebody's done an Ironman? And they're like, don't worry, they'll tell you. And I kind of feel like it's almost like that with a heat pump. How do you know if somebody's got a heat pump? Don't worry, they'll tell you. Because people who have got heat pumps uh, probably care a lot about decarbonisation, want to be on the edge of things, and are excited and have done a lot of research. And they have managed to work their way through all the misconceptions and all the confusion. So I think the single biggest misconception is that a heat pump is more expensive than a gas boiler to run today. There's some fabulous work. There's some brilliant organisations who are doing some really useful work on this and are helping optimize heat pumps using technology. And what they've shown is that actually, if you move on to some sort of an agile tariff or a tariff which is set up for heat pumps, they will be cheaper. You will save between 500 and £1,000 depending on your house and the tariffs you're on. So
And does
that
that
that is a
include
material
the
thing.
so does that include the cost of getting it installed in the first place?
No, that does not include the cost. That is just the running cost.
Mm.
Um, and then to install a heat pump, it is more expensive than a boiler,
Mm.
but our government is doing a wonderful job of giving £7,500 boiler upgrade scheme, BUS, it's called for short, catchy, BUS grants, which for many, many households brings down the cost of the heat pump to much the same as a boiler. And within that cost, there's also some retrofit. So that's what's determining the cost of your heat pump. Isn't just the size of the heat pump you want, but there are upgrades that you need to make to the house to keep it more insulated and to help it work better. So the fundamental difference about how we run a heat pump versus a boiler is a heat pump runs, we call it low and slow. So you might run it all the time at a lower temperature. Um, Whereas a boiler, we tend to, we fire it up when we get home from work and we let the house get really cold and then we put loads of heat in to heat it up again. Whereas a heat pump, actually, you keep the
Mm.
house warmer all day by firing this heat pump as you go. But that's quite a cultural shift for us as to how we heat our homes, and actually can mean that your home is much nicer and much more comfortable. And the phrase people use is cozy. It can be a really cozy house because
Mm.
actually it's warm all day. It's not cold and then it's sort of finally warm at 5 o'clock.
Yeah, of course. I mean, how much is the price though an issue? Because I mean, this average cost of what, 12,500 to buy and install a heat pump, even with that 7.5 grand subsidy, that's still what, 5 grand, which is quite an expensive boiler, um, which you've got to
I think
shell out. I mean, is it how much of an issue do you think it is compared to the other issues?
I think it's definitely part of the barrier. I think the unknown is more of it. I think it's
Hmm.
something that, you know, I mean, one of the reasons that my co-founder and I, Chris, started Dabalox was I met somebody who had actually taken out a perfectly working gas boiler and upgraded it with a new, almost identical gas boiler because they were in their 70s and they were terribly worried that in their 80s their gas boiler might stop working and then they would have to go through this, what they saw as this awful journey to having a heat pump. My whole house is going to get disrupted. Everything's going to change. It's going to be really expensive. I'm going to be cold and I'm going to be poor. And I think that moment really shocked me when you realize that somebody feels that strongly and that fearful that they've actually gone and replaced a boiler that works, that probably could have done another 15 years, probably would have seen them out. And actually, they have quite a well insulated house that would have been, a pretty good fit for a heat pump.
Mm.
So I think that this unknown around it, the unknown, the complexity, and as an industry, we haven't yet perfected making it simple for people. There's a lot of sort of sucking of teeth. Well, oh, you're going to have some different radiators here, and we need to do some insulation and insulation in houses. We haven't yet cracked that. So we've got loft insulation down to a
Mm.
T. We all know what we need to do with that. But actually, wall insulation, much harder, can be very disruptive if you're doing it internally. If you've got a pretty little building, you don't really want to do it on the outside. Um, and then you hear, people worry about if you don't get the insulation perfect, how that works out. So these are all the things that are fueling people's fears. Um, but what's
Yeah.
amazing is when people do have heat pumps, they're really happy with it. They find it a
Yes, that's
really
interesting. Yeah. The
amazing
surveys show that they're very, very positive as well. Could I just
experience.
pick you up on that, the insulation thing? Because that is something that you hear a lot, isn't it? That, well, so many old homes and, it's not going to work, this heat pump, because of the poor insulation. What's your sort of, what advice do you give at Dabalox on that?
Well, I mean, Dabalox, we're there to answer people's questions using the information that they get from an installer and the details of their house. So we will always sort of, the answer they get will be very driven by their installer's approach, and able to give them a really personalized answer. Um, but I think, if we step back on that, we go, well, there's a number of different solutions to how you can deal with the insulation. More and more, we're seeing the development of higher temperature heat pumps. So they run a temperature round the system, which is more similar to what you would have with a gas boiler. So we talked about this slow and low heating, but actually you can do it slow and warmer
Mm.
heating. So that means in a house with a lot of heat loss, actually you could put in a higher temperature heat pump and you would be able to use that. There are other organisations, some great startups who are looking at totally turning the whole heat pump journey on its head. So some great companies out there who are putting in a heat pump and then putting in lots and lots of sensors and then working out where you need to retrofit. Because it may be actually um, you're okay with having your house a little bit cooler, or actually there's just a couple of rooms that you really need to address. And so
Mm.
there the advantage is it's not using modeled data, it's using real world data. And they still need to model it to get the right size heat pump. But there are ways that you can kind of take out all the friction of you've got to do all these things before you get the heat pump. So I think things are changing. We also know the government is currently reviewing how they award the bus grant, and their expectations of heat pumps. And I think we're optimistic that the government may start to open up the conversations around hybrid systems. So, be that you're allowed to have some level of electrical boost in there, or potentially even keeping a gas boiler. But this idea that it may not all be on the heat pump to heat the whole house. And I think that starts to, again, open up lots and lots of different options for poorly insulated houses or houses that are made of particular materials that mean when it's windy, they lose a lot more heat. That means actually you could have some sort of boost for those few days of a year or 10 days of a year when actually it's really cold and you need some help.
Mm. I'd love to get into a bit more detail about what you're doing at Dabalox and where you fit into all of the different barriers, or what sort of barriers are you break taking down, if you like, when it comes to getting heat pumps rolled
Yeah,
out.
so we've gone and spoken to lots of installers, and we're really, really interested to hear their stories about how many questions customers have. So by the time a customer goes to an installer, they are curious and they're quite far down their customer journey. They're sort of in a place of like, "Well, we think we might do this." They've managed to cut through some of the negative noise,
Mm.
but it's still new. It's still a very big expenditure on your house when you're sort of trading off. Somebody describes it as you could have marble worktops that everyone can see, or you can have a heat pump. It is, there is a sort of elements of you're investing in something that isn't so visible, but actually will improve your quality of life every day, and you'll have a warmer, cozier home. Um, But the installers have told us customers have a lot of questions. We had one installer told us that they had a customer who asked them over 100 questions during the buying journey. And they are asking questions of people who aren't sat at home behind a desk, like you and I are right now. I can get emails through and I can answer them because I'm here. They're asking questions of people who are out in the field, who've chosen a job that's hands-on, that's face-to-face, and actually you've got emails, you've got text messages, you've got answer phone messages, you've got all these different ways that your customers want to contact you. And we're in a world where people want instantaneous answers. And that is really hard. That you can spend, as an installer, spend a lot of time helping a potential customer or a customer answer the questions when you want to be either installing or going out and finding new customers. And so what installers have told us is that actually most of the questions are pretty simple for them. They get the same questions and they can give them the same answer every time. But crucially, it's not the same generic answer. It's an answer that's suited to how that installer works and that particular house. So when we think about heat pumps, there is no one way to do heat pumps at the moment. There are lots and lots of different ways. And that's where actually you need to have a really personalized answer. So one of the questions they often get is, why do I have a buffer tank? Do I need a buffer tank or not a buffer tank? And this is where installers need to try and one, persuade their customers to, listen to them and to trust their recommendation, and then also keep them off the Facebook groups, because these Facebook groups are huge and people go onto Facebook groups, they go onto ChatGPT, they get onto Google, and they get some decent answers, but they're not personalized to their property and their installer. So what we're doing with Dabalox is actually looking at how can we give somebody an automated answer which is personalized to their installer and their home. And how do we do that? Well, actually, we're using AI in the back end. And that's where we know that AI is actually really good at giving personalized answers. So in the back end, it will have all the documents for your home and for your installer. And your installer will have also coached the system. So they'll have put in voice notes, for instance, and key documents and all of their kind of T's and C's and FAQs. So actually the system is almost like a virtual copy of the installer. Imagine if you're an installer and you have an assistant who really knows how you think and really knows how your business works, and they can pick up all of your questions from your customers. But even better than that, they know the last conversation that you had with them because they've also been there taking notes. And so we're using AI to handhold the installer and the homeowner through that journey. And we see it as augmenting the installer, not replacing them, because actually there's going to be times when the system can't answer the question and it needs to go back to an installer. And we need to make sure we don't, the word we use in the industry is hallucinate, or we can call it make it up, because that is not helpful. So this allows an installer to also see the questions that a homeowner is asking and also intervene if they don't like the answer the system's given them. And it won't remove the face-to-face time, it won't remove that trust that you need in that customer journey. But if we can take out 10% of those questions, then that is material, because the installers have told us they're spending an entire day per project answering questions. That's a lot of time.
So you're effectively sort of easing that the friction in the sales funnel. Use a few analogies there. Would that be a good way of
I
putting
think
it?
that's a great description, because it is easing it, and it will allow installers more time to actually get customers through the sales funnel. But there's a lot of getting a heat pump takes a lot longer, partly because the availability of suppliers at the moment, but also sometimes people are doing it as part of a bigger refurb. So we've met installers who say, well, my buying journey cycle is 4 to 12 months, because actually somebody is doing a heat pump installation as part of a much bigger house refurbishment. And I'll tell you what, no one's going to remember the conversation from 4 months earlier. We all think we do. You know how you always think, I don't take notes, I'll remember it. I mean, I don't know about you, but I'll tell you what, I don't remember it. And I think that's the key thing, that we've got technology now that can allow us to pull these things in, can essentially note take for us. So then we can go back and query it. Nobody's going to read the transcript from a conversation. being able to ask questions of it. What did they say about that? Oh, that's what they said.
And you mentioned something before we started the podcast about getting the grants and these huge long applications and details. That was really interesting. Could you just mention that?
Yeah. So, I mean, for a heat pump company to get this bus grant, I think they've got to fill in over a 60, 70 page document for the MCS. And this takes time, and this is not their core job.
Mm,
And more we hear about, for instance, retrofit coordinators who are coordinating big projects, often in social housing, and they have to document each and every house and record all that information. Doesn't necessarily need to be written up, but actually somehow there's got to be notes captured. Um, and the paperwork, the onerous paperwork is really growing. And I think this makes me feel very optimistic around people who are fearful around what is AI going to take my job? Well,
mm.
I'd say to the installer community, no, it's not going to take your job, but it's going to take some of the workload you don't love doing. Because if you
Right.
love sitting behind a computer and writing all day, you're probably not going to go and become an installer.
And there
But
aren't
this
enough installers, are there? There's a
there
big
aren't
shortage.
there aren't enough installers. We've got a massive shortage. And so actually this is where we can really use this to start to take away some of the friction points. Um, and I think, my personal experience is I'm dyslexic, and actually we find many people in the installer community are also dyslexic. And my co-founder and I it keeps coming back to, like, how can we take the friction out? How can you minimize the to-do list, minimize the mental load, just make it easier for people to capture the information they need to, share the information, and have it really accessible for themselves. And this is where AI-based tools can be fabulous at doing that.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And we're coming to the end, but I'd love to know how you're doing and how this is being rolled out at the moment. What sort of stage are you at?
Yeah, we are really early doors. So we're very fortunate that we met on a Carbon 13 venture building program. So we've had fabulous support from them as we've built out our idea. And we have got three early customers who have been huge supports, and we're working with them to test our MVP.
Mm.
So we've got something that's ready to get into their hands, and once they've tested that, we'll be able to build out the next set of features, and we're hoping to do our beta launch in September, along with a funding round, just to help give us a little bit more kind of journey time to build out tools for the industry.
Absolutely. And what's the sort of feedback been so far, this early stage feedback?
It's interesting how we're learning around how businesses use it versus how we thought they'd use it.
Mm,
So one of the key elements of Dabalox is having an account between a homeowner and an installer, so that the homeowner can actually access that information, and you keep each of those accounts as separate. But we've had some interest from some of our installers around actually how can they use this approach to capture the best practice for their own business. So they can almost have a sort of teaching account, so they can start to put in their best practice, and then other people in the team can start to query the system about their own business's approach. And we've had some other customers who are really interested around how they can use this when they're working with a really cross-functional, cross-business team. So they're working with electricians, they're working with plumbers, builders, architects. Actually, is this something that they can then use to all input into, to all have one common set of information that they can all really easily query? So we're definitely seeing some interesting approaches around how businesses are using it how we thought they would, but also in quite novel ways. And I think that's something that we find very exciting, because there are a lot of different ways that you can use it once you've got this set up.
yeah. And it's such a, well, fast growing, but still pretty small industry, I suppose, at the moment.
It is,
So,
and the technology we're using, we'd call it AI now commoditized. It's like, 10 years ago, no, forget that, 30 years ago, you said, my business is using email. Wow, you'd be so excited. Now, like, everyone uses it. And actually, we'd say the same with the AI. It's not the actual AI that's the differentiator. It's how we're packaging it up and how we're working out how you prompt how you utilize it in your customer journey. Um, and so that's the key piece. And I think the technology's moved on so fast that what we're building now, we couldn't have built a year ago. Wouldn't have been possible.
Mm. Well, Caroline, I think you've done a fantastic job of bringing together the general context of the need for heat pumps and down to the specific details. Um, Super interesting. Thank you so much for coming on the show.
Thank you very much for having me.